Welcome. So I'm Aaron Jackson, a professor of economics at Bentley University. So today in this video, we're going to be looking at the money multiplier and the process behind the money multiplier. Now, in the previous video, you probably would have seen this basic process and the mechanics behind it and the accounting, the T accounts that sort of support and tell the story of the multiplier. But some of the key limitations that we outlined in that are the following. So under that basic framework where we looked at the multiplier, we assumed that people don't hold any currency and banks don't hold any excess reserves. And so in that framework, what we saw is that the multiplier factor in that basic setup was simply 1 over the required reserve ratio. So when the required reserve ratio was 10%, we saw a 10-fold change in the money supply when we had changes in the monetary base. And so this video is really focused at thinking about how we can relax those assumptions and what it means for this multiplier process. Now, more generally, when we think about this relationship between the Fed pushing and pulling reserves into and out of the banking system, again, that affects the monetary base. And as we've seen, there's this multiplier factor that occurs. And that translates through to the overall money supply. So the idea here is that we have the money supply, M, big M, capital M, is equal to the money multiplier, little m, times the monetary base. And so that's how all of these things come together in terms of the Fed influencing the money supply is by changing the monetary base. Again, that all presumes that the multiplier itself is relatively, excuse me, is relatively stable. So again, the monetary base is composed of currency plus reserves, and the overall money supply, as we'll see later on, is essentially, we're going to define it as the amount of checking deposits and the amount of currency that's floating around. And so what we'll see in this video, in this section of the chapter, is that this multiplier process still works if we relax those assumptions. But as it turns out, the multiplier effect is going to be smaller than what we saw before. If people hold currency, if bank holds excess reserves, then what that intuitively means is that there's going to be less lending going on in the banking system, which is going to create less deposits downstream and therefore create a smaller amount of money as a result of changes in the reserves. So a couple quick definitions. So first of all, we're going to define the money supply very simply as the amount of currency in circulation plus the amount of checkable deposits that are deposits at banks in the banking system. So this is essentially the M1 money supply that we looked at earlier in this chapter. Excuse me. The total amount of reserves is going to be divided between required reserves and excess reserves. So the amount of required reserves are a fraction of total deposits that banks hold. So by law, banks are required to hold a certain fraction of the deposits that they have on hand as required reserves. So you can essentially think of these as reserves that go into the vault of the bank that they have to have. And so that's going to be equal to the total amount of required reserves, is going to be equal to the required reserve ratio times the total amount of deposits in the banking system or in the bank. And then banks can choose to hold excess reserves above the required amount, and that's just going to be the difference between total reserves and required reserves. A second definition here is the currency ratio, and later on you'll see that I'm going to differentiate little c and big C by putting a bar below the little c and putting some little teeth on the big C there to differentiate those two. The currency deposit ratio is simply the ratio of total currency relative to deposits in the banking system. And that's going to be a definition that we're going to use to come up with this refined multiplier. The excess reserve ratio, little e, that's just the, excuse me, the excess reserve ratio, little e, is just the ratio of total excess reserves divided by the amount of deposits. And so this actually should be, as I have it here, excess ER divided by D, not E divided by D, to make the notation consistent. And then the required reserve ratio we can transform our understanding of this. We can play around. It's just a definition, so little RR is equal to the total amount of required reserves divided by deposits. So you can express it in that way. So how do we get to the multiplier? I'm going to go to the smartboard, and I'll show you how we get there. So we're going to use these definitions. Oops. We're going to use these definitions that we just talked about here. So first of all, the amount of required, the total reserves is just required plus excess reserves. We can express the amount of required reserves as equal to the reserve ratio times deposits. And we can express the amount of excess reserves as equal to that excess reserve ratio times the amount of deposits. Again, this is just manipulating the definition of these things. So using those pieces there, we can express our total amount of reserves as equal to required reserves, which is that expression there, plus excess reserves, which is that expression right there. Okay. The next step is the monetary base. So here's the definition of the monetary base. Currency plus reserves. Okay. Now, reserves, we just derived this expression here for reserves. So we're going to put that expression for reserves into this definition of the monetary base. Likewise, we also have this relationship between currency and the currency deposit ratio. So again, this thing here is just a rearranging of that definition of the currency deposit ratio. So if we substitute this expression into currency here, then the monetary base ends up being equal to this expression right there. There's currency, there's required reserves, there's excess reserves. That is total reserves right there. Okay. So I promise we're getting to a point here. So we can simplify this thing as the monetary base is just equal to total deposits times these three things here. So that's just consolidating and simplifying this relationship. So I'm going to call this last equation, equation 1, and we're going to come back to this because we're going to use it here momentarily. So remember, monetary base is equal to the amount of deposits times this expression here. Okay. The second thing that we're going to do is look at the money supply. Again, what we're doing is we're connecting the monetary base and the money supply together with these relationships of these ratios. The money supply, again, we just defined that as total amount of currency in circulation plus the total amount of checkable deposits. And so the currency in circulation is given by that, so we just substitute that thing in there, okay? And then we can simplify this equation in the following way. Little c times d plus d is just equal to this expression here, okay? So the money supply is equal to 1 plus the currency deposit ratio times d. Now, the last step here is to rearrange this. And so we're going to solve for d as a function of everything else. And so if we do that, we get d is equal to m over 1 plus the currency deposit ratio. So this we're going to call equation 2. Ultimately, we're going to use equation 1 and equation 2 to link together the money supply and the monetary base simply through rearranging and manipulating through a little bit of algebra these definitions. So if we do this, if you recall, we have equation 1, which is this expression here. And equation 2 that we just derived, which is this expression. So if we take these two pieces that we just derived, we can substitute D from equation 2 into equation 1. And so what that gives us is the monetary base is equal to C plus E plus RR over 1 plus C times M. Okay, so there's one last step here. We're going to divide this expression here over to the other side. And so if we do that, what we get is the money supply is equal to 1 plus little c over little c plus E plus RR times the monetary base. And so what are we left with? Well, we're left with an expression which tells us when the Fed can push and pull reserves into and out of the banking system and effectively manipulate the monetary base. And then we also have this expression here, which we're going to call M, the multiplier. So at the end of the day, what we're left with is this expression where the money supply, cap M, is equal to little m, the multiplier, times the monetary base. So this allows us to relax those assumptions and connect monetary policy through changes in the monetary base along with behavior of depositors and banks and see how that actually translates to the money supply and more specifically changes in the money supply. Okay. And so this multiplier, again, is going to be an important aspect of thinking about how effective monetary policy is and what kinds of monetary policy needs to be done in order to influence the monetary base and therefore have an impact on the money supply. Oops. Okay. So if we look at this multiplier, again, we have this multiplier here, whoops, that we just derived. And so the question is, how do we think about this? Well, intuitively, there's a few things that we can draw from this. So first of all, if the currency deposit ratio increases, it turns out that that multiplier is going to go down under most normal conditions. And so the intuition here, again, is if people are holding more currency, that means that in all likelihood, they're holding less of their money in the form of deposits in banks, which means banks have less reserves to loan out, which means there's less deposits created downstream at other banks. And therefore, you get a muted effect on the multiplier. So when the currency deposit ratio goes up, you'd expect most of the time the multiplier would go down. So there would be a smaller increase in the money supply with an injection in reserves in the banking system. If the excess reserve ratio goes up, you have the exact same result. If banks are holding more excess reserves, that necessarily means they're making less loans out, which means that there's less deposits being created at other banks, which means there's less loans being created and more deposits being created downstream and so on and so forth. So higher excess reserve ratio is going to lead to, again, a decline in the multiplier, holding the monetary base constant. And finally, when the required reserve ratio goes up, again, the multiplier is going to go down for the exact same reasons the excess reserve ratio does the same thing. If banks are required by law to hold more required reserves, that means that the banks then are going to make less loans out as a result of that, and therefore there's going to be less downstream lending and deposit creation. And so that's going to have the effect also of dampening this multiplier effect. And then one final thing to keep to take note of here, our original basic multiplier problem was this. We originally assumed that households hold no currency and banks hold no excess reserves. So if, in this case, if we assume that those two things are equal to 0, you'll notice that the multiplier, right there, those two things become 0, and then the multiplier just defaults to this basic multiplier that we looked at in the previous video, 1 over the required reserve ratio, okay? Now, finally, I'm not going to talk about this, but if you want to, you can go through the math and take the derivatives of this money multiplier with respect to each of these factors, and you can see that under most conditions, these things are going to be negative, which support the intuitive discussion of what I just talked about, okay? So I'm going to run through a very quick example. So imagine if we have the required reserve ratio equal to 10%, the currency deposit ratio is equal to 0.15, and excess reserve ratio is equal to 0.25. If we put the numbers into our simple multiplier formula, again, we have M is equal to 1 plus C, which is 0.15, over 0.15 plus 0.25 plus 0.1. You end up with 1.15 over a half, which is equal to 2.3. So our money multiplier in this basic example is going to be 2.3. And so if we have an open market purchase of bonds by the Fed of $100, the monetary base is going to go up by $100, and that's because the amount of reserves in the banking system is going to rise initially by $100. The money supply itself is going to, again, get magnified by this impact factor, this 2.3. And so at the end of the day, that $100 increase in the monetary base is going to lead to a $230 increase in the overall money supply. And so in this case, in this example, there's still this multiplier effect, but it's less than what we saw in the basic case where we had this tenfold increase to $1,000. So there's a few takeaways to come away with from this basic discussion. The first is that the Fed can control the monetary base pretty precisely, and that's because it has free rein to conduct open market operations as it sees fit. So it can push and pull reserves in and out of the banking system pretty seamlessly, and therefore control the monetary base itself pretty seamlessly. However, as we talked about in previous videos, the Fed can't control the composition of the monetary base because, as we've seen, people want to hold currency. So they might go into banks and withdraw money and hold that as currency. And so at some points, those reserves can get transformed into currency, and therefore that can affect the the multiplier as well. And so because of that discussion of the multiplier and how that comes into play, the Fed is going to have less control over the overall money supply because it can't control bank and it can't control necessarily bank and depositor behavior. And so because of that, when we put all of this stuff together, again, when we put together Fed, bank behavior, and deposit behavior, all three of those things come into play to dictate what the overall money supply is. And so when banks vary their behavior in terms of excess, put together Fed, bank behavior, and deposit behavior, all three of those things come into play to dictate what the overall money supply is. And so when banks vary their behavior in terms of excess reserves and holding reserves and those kinds of things, when depositor behavior varies in terms of their desires to hold currency versus deposits, that's going to affect the multiplier and therefore affect the money supply for a given open market operation or change in the monetary base. And so the punchline here is that banks and depositors can behave in sometimes unpredictable ways, which means the multiplier itself can vary and therefore have an impact on the money supply. And so to summarize this discussion, again, we have these three players here, the Fed, banks, and the non-bank public, okay? And so each of them plays a role in understanding the money supply. The Fed can push and pull reserves into and out of the banking system through open market operations and also what's referred to as quantitative easing or large-scale asset purchases, which operate essentially like open market operations. The Fed can create discount loans, so loan money to banks, which injects reserves into the banking system, and it can also require banks to hold reserves, and implicitly it could change the required reserve ratio. In practice, the Fed does not adjust the required reserve ratio as a practical policy tool. So for all intents and purposes, that's not going to impact the multiplier, okay? But the intuition, the intuition behind how the Fed impacts the money supply through these various channels is as following. Through open market operations and quantitative easing, it can affect the reserves and hence monetary base for a given multiplier that impacts the money supply. Through discount lending, the Fed can affect what's referred to as the amount of borrowed reserves in the banking system, which again affects reserves, the monetary base, and hence the money supply for a given multiplier. And then, as I said, the Fed can change the required reserve ratio, which impacts the multiplier for a given monetary base. That would also affect the money supply. But as I said, as a practical tool, the Fed does not adjust the required reserve ratio. Banks also play a role in this through their behavior of holding excess reserves. So for a change in excess reserve ratio, that affects the multiplier, and for a given monetary base, that translates into a change in the money supply. And then finally, you and I, we can change our behavior in terms of how much cash or deposits we hold. That affects the currency deposit ratio. Therefore, that affects the multiplier. And so again, for a given monetary base, that change in the multiplier is going to translate into a different money supply. And so you can have these variations in bank or depositor behavior, which can ultimately impact the money supply independent of what the Fed is doing. So that's a summary of how all of these pieces fit together. And if you think about these, again, the Fed has more or less control, and we think about the Fed as controlling the money supply, but there's these other factors that come into play too that means the Fed has less control over the money supply than we might initially think. Thank you.